Okay, so how does Priestley use the character of Sheila in Inspector Calls? What ideas does Sheila represent? What are some key scenes for this character? How does Priestley present this character, and why does Priestley present her in this way? So what ideas does Sheila represent? Well, it's obvious in a way. She's young, she's a woman, she has high social status, and she represents change and the possibility of social change. She is a character who changes her attitude during the play. So that means that she, for Priestley, represents the idea that people can change, unlike her mother, Mrs. Burling, who doesn't change her attitude despite everything that happens, and her father, Mr. Burling, and her fiancé, Gerald. She is expected, as an Edwardian young woman, she's expected to marry and live a life similar to her mother. But she's also historically about to get the vote. So women in 1912 were about 10 years away from being allowed to vote, maybe a bit less than that. So for Priestley, she is a future hope for change. She's a hope that change will come in the future. Of course, Priestley is writing in 1945, by which time major changes were on the way following World War II. The opening of the play, stage directions and some important hints from Sheila at the start. Now, it's very common for people to talk about how Sheila is very kind of silly at the start of the play. She's described as a pretty girl in her early 20s, pleased with life, rather excited. And this is because she's about to get married to Gerald Croft, who's an attractive chap. So she's excited, she's very bubbly, she's very happy on the night when the play starts. And a lot of people also quote the fact that she calls her mother Mummy. It makes her sound very young and childish. And Priestley's deliberately doing that, showing her to be a bit childish at the start of the play, so that she can mature later. Notice, though, there are hints right at the start that she is not just a bit silly, but she's also quite serious in some ways. She's already noticed that Gerald never came near her last summer, and notice the repeated stage direction that she's half serious, half playful, half serious when she's talking to him about that. Mrs. Burling, saying that when you're married, you'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to that, just as I had. Sheila says, I don't believe I will. So she's already, even though we might think of her as being a bit silly at the start of the play, or a bit immature, or a bit childish, she's already got these hints that she could be a bit of a rebel as well. So, next idea is that when she hears about the plight of Eva Smith, she's very sympathetic to Eva. She asks a lot of questions about Eva. What was she like? Is she pretty? And also when the inspector talks about cheap labour, she responds by saying they're not cheap labour, they're people. So she's heard this whole story about Eva Smith being sacked by her father for organising a strike, and she responds with this, they're not cheap labour, they're people. And that shows Sheila's capacity for sympathy. Priestley is using the economic language of cheap labour to show that she's against the idea of treating people as if they're just sort of numbers on a spreadsheet. I've got a little graph here on this slide showing how cheap labour is. So this is your hourly wage. I mean, I don't know what year this is from, but it gives you an idea. In Germany, it's much more expensive to pay someone. In the UK, it's a bit less expensive to pay someone to work for you. We'll look down here in Indonesia, India, Thailand, Taiwan. In the 19th century or the early 20th century, when Inspector Calls is set, we weren't sending goods off to Taiwan to be produced. We weren't employing people in Taiwan, Thailand. Britain was employing much poorer people in this country. So that's what she's talking about. They're not cheap labour, they're people. She's sympathetic for real people having real lives. Priestley's use of economic language shows Sheila's sympathy and the way she juxtaposes that economic language with something sympathetic, that they're real people. Her emotional reaction is also important for Sheila. So she's not just intellectually engaged and asking questions. She reacts emotionally to what's happened, especially when she realizes that she is partly responsible for Eva Smith's death. For example, she exits the stage in tears. She starts crying and runs off the stage and comes back later. And the dashes that Priestley uses in her dialogue show her emotion. And I'll explain why this is important in a sec. Let's just have a look at that bit. So I'm just going to scroll down through the script. And of course, this is when she is actually going through her story of how she got Eva Smith sacked from Millwards. Okay, so as when she realizes it's because the inspector shows her the picture. Be aware that showing the picture is a method of J.B. Priestley. He has props in his play to show, to use this photograph to show different characters, to show them the picture of Eva Smith so they recognize her. So he produces a photograph. She looks at it closely, recognizes it with a little cry, gives a half-stifled sob, and then runs out. So her exit off the stage shows how emotional she is about this. Contrast, think about how Mrs. Burling reacts to the photograph. She actually pretends that she doesn't recognize the person in it, I believe, if I'm remembering this rightly. Anyway, so she runs off the stage. She's very emotional. She comes back, looks as if she's been crying, and she comes back to go through the whole story. And again, she's asking questions. So I'm really responsible. And she's very honest, because I was in a furious temper. She got Eva sacked. And I just want to point out, as I said, the use of dashes with this is very common with Priestley. He wants to show emotion, uses dashes in the speech that Sheila says. So and she almost breaks down. The dashes show that she's sort of starting to cry again, and she tells Eric to shut up, repeating "I know," repetition. I've never ever done anything like this, and I'll never do it again to anybody. Now, all this emotion is important because it shows that Sheila is sympathetic to Eva. And that's different from Mr. Burling. It's different from Mrs. Burling. Gerald's quite sympathetic, but he also tries to get out of it all later on. And Eric is also quite sympathetic. So the younger people too tend to be more sympathetic. But her sympathy with Eva shows that Sheila is willing to think of Eva as a person who has needs and wants that should be provided by society. It shows a level of solidarity with Eva, and that's the point of that. Okay, so the next part to just flag up is Sheila's break from Gerald and her movement towards the inspector. So, and not just Gerald, from her family as well. So she starts to move away from Gerald, starts to move away from the Burling family in the way she's thinking, and starts to disagree with them as the play goes on. Let's find an example. At the end of Act 1, this is the way she talks to Gerald. And this is the guy who's a very posh man. He's almost aristocracy. He is going to marry her. She's supposed to respect him. She's supposed to play a sort of second class status to him. He's supposed to be the important one. And she's, at this point in the play, she calls him a fool. He knows, of course he knows. I hate to think how much he knows that we don't know yet. You'll see. She looks at him almost in triumph. So it's almost like she's won some kind of battle against Gerald at this point. She looks at him in triumph. So the use of stage directions show that she's really rebelling against Gerald at this point. Whereas before she was kind of just looking in a sort of silly way at a lovely engagement ring that he'd got her, and she thought everything was wonderful. But calling him a fool is a really important moment. The repetition of we don't know and he knows, the inspector knows. The inspector is omniscient and knows everything. And Sheila starts to recognize that. We also get moments where she sort of crosses the stage towards him. So, for example, here, there's some more dashes here. I know I'm to blame. I'm desperately sorry. Dash, but I can't believe. Dash, I won't believe. Dash, it's simply my fault that in the end she committed suicide. That would be too horrible. So this is showing her emotion again. And then the repetition of "you know" to the inspector, "you know," she says to him. And she goes close to him wonderingly. "I don't understand about you," she says. So the fact that Sheila moves on the stage closer to the inspector symbolizes her moving over to him in the way that she's thinking as well, and the sympathy she has for Eva, and the more likelihood that she'll change her attitude and go over to a more kind of sympathetic attitude towards the poor and the working class. In a similar way, she uses this quote when she's talking to Mrs. Burling. This is when Mrs. Burling is making the mistake of thinking she can battle the inspector and pretend to get and sort of try and get out of her responsibilities. Sheila says, "You mustn't try to build up a kind of wall between us and that girl." And this is a really great metaphor. It's always nice to have a metaphor to get your teeth stuck into. It's a metaphor for class division and divisions in wealth between rich and poor. So Sheila there is saying there shouldn't be a wall between us and that girl. There shouldn't be a wall dividing us, and using that metaphor. And that's important because, again, it shows her sympathy. This is why Priestley is doing this, because it shows her sympathy for Eva and the working class, and the idea that she thinks that they're not different, that they've got needs, wants, and need help sometimes, just like anyone would, and that they don't get the proper help. So that's an important idea, that people aren't divided by class and wealth divisions. Okay, so next one. The very last thing that I want to point out here, there's lots more to say about Sheila, I'm sure, but I'm just trying to sort of trace her development through the play, because she is a character that develops. Finally, at the end of the play, she completely breaks from Gerald, it would seem, and she symbolically rejects Gerald's ring at the end. She says to him, "I've got to think." She doesn't accept when he says, "What about this ring?" and tries to give it back to her. And a ring is always symbolic. That's why people give rings for engagement and marriage. And so it's always representing something. Usually people think of a ring as representing eternity and faithfulness and things like that. The fact that Sheila rejects Gerald's ring at the end of the play suggests that she's rejecting not just him personally for his actions, but she's rejecting his world as well. So she's rejecting the idea of joining him in marriage and having the same sort of life as her mother. Maybe she's thinking about how her life might be different in the future, how she might have to step up politically and take part in a political sort of action. She's going to get the vote soon. She's a young woman. Maybe she's someone that will see this is Priestley's hope, maybe she's someone that will see the injustice in the way that poorer people are treated in British society and try and do something about it. And there were women of that sort of class, women of Sheila's class, who did that during the early part of the 20th century and became quite socialist and campaigned for the vote, etc., etc., etc. This is Priestley's hope, that she represents some kind of future change in English society, in British society. Okay, that's Sheila. If you get a question about Sheila, you'll be able to write about all those things. Even if you get a question about a theme, like, social class or responsibility or sympathy or whatever it is, then Sheila is a good character to talk about because she's one of the most important characters in the play.